We'll just wait about 2-3 more minutes and then we'll start.
She's I think she's married and she's in the travel.
Some stuff in hard meeting from Pete. Called me at noon and told me he would get it done. Yeah. I'm not sure. It might be another argument with the public safety officers, but I mean, I don't understand. Maybe there's a holdup because like there is some issue with public safety, and maybe that's also why Stephen didn't get back to me. But I don't think so. I really think that it's just that he's busy, and despite what he said, this isn't a priority. We should maybe wait. If we have the letter from him.
We have one chair. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay,
No.
So we have one more chair.
one more chair.
Okay, so he's there.
We're discussing that.
I have the impression that you are lacking behind the ground.
We do.
Watch out.
Well, let's hear this one.
I had to.
You mentioned what you have seen in Syria.
everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, impact and solutions. Armed conflict that broke out in eastern Ukraine over a year ago led to a devastating humanitarian crisis, affecting more than 2 million people. Currently in Ukraine, there is 1.2 million registered internally displaced people. Close to 800,000 are refugees in neighboring countries. So we have gathered here today to raise awareness about the devastating humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. That's arguably the largest one in Europe for the past 20 years, and also to discuss with the experts in the field on the issues on the ground, on the impact and solutions to the suffering of millions of Ukrainians. So we're honored to have the director of UNHCR, Mr. Udo Jens, First Secretary of Humanitarian Affairs Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, Mr. Razom, and UNICEF Emergency Officer, Mr. Dragan Markovic, who will engage in discussion with us today. I'll make a very short introduction to every speaker. Mr. Udo Jens is the director of the UNHCR Office in New York. He joined the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in 1979. During his long and distinguished career with UNHCR, he has served in Indonesia, Thailand, Hong Kong, Cambodia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Following the armed conflict in Georgia in August 2008, he acted as a co-moderator for the Working Group on Humanitarian Issues under the Geneva International Discussions in an effort to ensure access to all displaced populations in conflict areas for the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance and protection. Mr. Jens will discuss the refugee issues, emergency and crisis intervention programs, and Ukraine's current and long-term situation. Mr. Jesus Diaz-Carazo is First Secretary of Humanitarian Affairs Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. Prior to his position, Mr. Diaz-Carazo was the Director of Communications of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation in Madrid. Earlier, he worked as a communications officer at the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation. Mr. Diaz-Carazo will speak on the EU humanitarian action in Ukraine. Finally, Mr. Dragan Markovic is an emergency officer at UNICEF, where he overlooks UNICEF Ukraine's response to the emergency issues on the ground. Mr. Markovic has an extensive professional experience working in the emergency field. Prior to his work with UNICEF, he worked as a program manager at the Danish Refugee Council and International Rescue Committee for over a decade. And Mr. Markovic will speak about Ukraine's response to the emergency issues on the ground. So each speaker will present for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and have discussion. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Mr. Jens?
Okay, then I start. Thank you very much for the introduction, and sorry to bore you with those lengthy biographies. In my case, it takes a bit longer simply by virtue of age, because your CV gets longer as you seem to continue to work in the business, but thank you anyway. It's nice. I'm the two of us, in fact, Jesus and myself, have not been to the Ukraine since the outbreak of the conflict. I have been there previously in my former incarnation with UNHCR as Deputy Director for Europe, where I had to deal with all the so-called frozen conflicts in Eastern Europe. But since I have been assigned to New York, not been back, and so Dragan is the only authority that we have sitting at the panel who has actually been there recently. Just last month, 14 of the UN's so-called emergency directors for humanitarian action visited the Ukraine. That in an attempt to harmonize the response of the United Nations family, to draw on common advocacy understandings, and to get a first-hand impression at the same time, both in government-controlled areas and to the extent that you can, also in non-government controlled areas. What they found was truly shocking and truly mind-boggling. I've just said in the car to Jesus that for me, every conflict has a face and has an image to it. In the Ukraine, that image for me, more than anything else, is of an elderly woman, probably a widow, without access to her pension, without access to daily necessities, who is really scrambling to make ends meet and is clearly vulnerable to all kinds of external forces. That is the fate, more or less, of some 5 million people that the emergency directors found in need of humanitarian assistance, not to speak of the record to date, which of course has to be taken with a big pinch of salt, of some 6,000 that have probably been killed or more, and some 15,000 or so wounded to date. All of these figures are just really at best guesstimates and are not in any way something that you can rely on. Overall, there have been 2 million people by now who have been forced to flee from their homes, either internally as IDPs, what we call the internally displaced people, or as refugees abroad. Now that's, if we assume that the Ukraine today still has in excess of 40 million people, that is a significant toll that the war has so far taken. Among those 1.2 million, just to drive the point home, and you'll see this in this map that I distributed, because it is a breakdown also of the displacement and where it occurs, which also includes a breakdown by group in terms of the color coding. The dark green are what is generally referred to as pensioners. And you'll see why I depicted the picture of the elderly woman. Out of the 1.2 million, 730,000 or so are pensioners, 277,000 are people of working age, 153,000 are children, and 50,000 or so are disabled, also a very high proportion of the population. Of the 777,000 or so who sought refuge outside, inevitably the bulk has moved east into the Russian Federation and asked for some form of protection, either by lodging an asylum claim or for another form of temporary protection that exists in the Russian Federation domestic legal context. And a further 81,000 or so went north to Belarus and have received protection there. Surprisingly, until the end of last year, only, and I say only, some 14,000 people had sought protection elsewhere in the European Union countries. And even that is very much limited to half a dozen or so countries, Poland, Germany, and a couple of others. But not in troves and not in the numbers that, given the scale of the conflict and the length of the conflict, you would expect different figures. The internal debates that we have in the United Nations humanitarian system obviously have primarily to do with access to the population according to our humanitarian principles, as we refer to them, regardless of under whose control the population is. The driving force should be needs-based assistance wherever it occurs to whoever it requires. And that, of course, limits the extent to which assistance can be provided. Both material assistance in terms of shelter, non-food items, but also a bit more hard to define assistance, like legal assistance for people who have lost their property and are trying to protect their property if they are no longer there, rather than leaving it to the elements. Clearly, with the situation not improving in the short term, we are heading towards yet another protracted displacement situation with no short-term end of the conflict in sight and no solution in sight there for those who have been displaced to return in the short term. Hence, we have to prepare ourselves, or at least in the medium term, to provide shelter in situ, wherever people are, to the extent that they are accommodated with relatives, friends, former neighbors, associates that they have who open their homes and provide them with the basics, the basic necessities. That is clearly by far the most preferable solution, although there's also clearly a limit on how long that hospitality will be extended. We see that happening everywhere in the world. There comes a point when that's becoming very difficult to sustain. Others are accommodated in collective shelters to the extent that they exist. I'm talking really about schools, disused hospitals, empty buildings, anything that can be harnessed and utilized with a basic minimum investment to make it habitable, where the international community, together with the Ukrainian authorities, provides the basic infrastructure, including electricity, heating, etc., especially during the hard winter months. Now that puts a strain clearly on everyone. The Ukraine is also a country that until recently did not have legislation to govern what to do in terms of internal displacement. As you know, the international legislation, if you can call it that, governing internal displacement is a set of guiding principles, as that is known. There is no hard and fast law, there is no treaty. It is by analogy from the refugee conventions that a treaty, a body of legal understanding has been developed by the first rapporteur on internally displaced persons, Francis Deng, who was based at the Brookings Institution and in a concerted effort over several years came up ultimately with what he referred to as the guiding principles of how to engage with the internally displaced persons, who of course are fundamentally in a different situation than refugees are. The moment you cross an international boundary, you are protected under an international treaty that 147 governments to this day have signed into domestic legislation as well. So clearly there is a system of protection in place internationally if and when you cannot count on the protection of your own government in situ. That role of safeguarding that treaty of protection has been given to the UN Refugee Agency, and by default, UNHCR also therefore extends a protection function in cases where governments are either unwilling or unable to provide that protection in asylum countries. In internal displacement, that of course is not so. Citizens of a country are always under the protection of their own government, at least that is the theory. And until and unless that link is broken, people find themselves rapidly in a very deteriorating humanitarian situation, as we've seen in a very short time span, where the idea or the very notion of internal displacement was probably unthinkable for most of the population that today find themselves in that very situation. In your introductory remarks, you mentioned the probability that the displacement in the Ukraine today has probably reached the largest proportion for the last 20 or so years in the European continent. If you refer to that with the displacement in the Balkans and the Western Balkans, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina, that might be the last major crisis where the numbers were larger, obviously, than we are talking about now. But what was even more difficult to fathom at the time was that the percentage of the population as a whole was just incomparable. Because in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was over 50% of the population that was driven from their homes and became displaced either as IDPs or refugees. Now let's keep our fingers crossed that we don't have to go into that dimension in the current situation, but it's obvious that the longer the drama and the crisis continues, the more difficult it will be to ultimately come to an understanding between the warring factions and parties to agree on a common way forward. We've seen this elsewhere. This is not the only protracted conflict situation. We have seen it in neighboring Georgia. We've seen it in the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, specifically referring to Nagorno-Karabakh. And the longer these so-called frozen conflicts continue, the more evident it will become that nothing, in fact, is frozen, but that they can be activated at any time if it is in the interest of one party or the other. So what to do? In the interim, we can only try to, for one, change the legislative context within the country. You can try to extend the protection in the external domain to the extent that the Refugee Convention is biting. In other words, that countries open their doors, maintain open borders, and provide that assistance and protection regime that the Refugee Convention requires of its signatories, and internally to try to regularize the legal regime to the point where people are indeed recognized as a specific group that requires specific assistance. It is no longer sufficient to rely on the social security system that is in place for the population at large, but it is a recognition that IDPs are indeed vulnerable in a very specific meaning and need specific help over and above that. That is, for example, extended to pensioners or others who are in need of medical assistance or whatever their situation might be. That is no easy job. It requires a change in legislation. It requires, obviously, a deep digging into your pockets, which is not the easiest thing to come by when you're facing a situation where the currency has been hit hard by inflation, where unemployment is very high, where there aren't enough jobs to go around for the population at large, and where the displaced are, if you like, doubly discriminated against, and obviously are finding it very, very hard to make ends meet. As part of the family-wide, UN-wide humanitarian response plan, UNHCR, specifically the refugee agency, has taken the lead to provide for protection, which translated means in very concrete terms that first of all we would like to know who is displaced, hence we assist the local and central government authorities in the registration of those who are displaced, making sure that we have a full gender and age breakdown of the population and as much information as we can about their particular needs. Also to extend to the extent possible, and that depends, as I referred to earlier already, on access to the population to provide the necessary shelter and what we generally refer to as non-food items, and of course ensure beyond that, that to the extent that food aid is required, that our partners from the food program provide that to the extent that it is required. Obviously, all that has to come at the request of the government. That is one of the preconditions in any internal displacement situation that is quite different from the refugee situation outside. At the same time, as I said earlier, obviously we work with governments in the asylum countries to maintain an open border regime and provide protection for those who need it, either through an individual determination of their status or by providing a blanket prima facie, as we refer to that, refugee status on a group of people. Further, to support the government in its efforts to establish a central authority that has not existed hitherto to deal with the issue of IDPs. Is it the Ministry of Social Welfare? Is it the Ministry of Interior? Who is responsible for it? And what are the particular terms of reference for that department or ministry to deal with it? And as I said, work with the government to improve the registration system wherever it is done, and procedures, special procedures relating to vulnerable populations, especially the elderly, those who are in urgent need for access to social assistance, etc. The key issues that we will grapple with for some time to come is obviously freedom of movement, given that this is extremely limited. Facilitated access for humanitarian workers to go in and assist those that are in need. Respect by all parties to the conflict of the humanitarian principles, and as an immediate effect of that, obviously, then unhindered and unfettered humanitarian access to the population, restoring the rule of law throughout the country, not just in one pocket or the other, but throughout the country, and full implementation of the internal displacement legislation to the extent that it is rolled out, especially with regard to access to housing, also taxation of humanitarian assistance that is provided, and registration-related issues. To date, in my own personal view at least, the successes or otherwise that the humanitarian community has had are mixed, given the situation that is so intransigent on the ground. We have had huge deliveries of food that are given out on a monthly basis, so it's not just a one-time effort, but it's repeatedly done and reaches about 6,100 vulnerable families per month. Obviously, those in the most dire situation have been accommodated in collective shelters that have been prepared and restored to the extent that there is something to restore by the international community. And we now have to praise ourselves for, obviously, a political solution that will only come about if and when the pain factor for all parties has reached a point whereby they're willing to sit down and discuss an end to the hostilities and an end to the conflict, which no humanitarian solution will bring about. I think it is a truism that we repeat in many parts of the world. There is no humanitarian solution for a humanitarian problem. It is always and will always be a political solution that is required in order for the guns to fall silent. So let's leave it there for the time being. I'm happy to answer any questions for those of you who have any afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Developments. And then our next speaker will be humanitarian on the EU's response to the humanitarian crisis.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you all. Thank you for coming here. I would like to start by thanking the NGO European Association for European Union Association for his kind invitation, and I would like to thank you, the Columbia University, particularly Human Rights Project Group, the Human Rights Working Group, the Ukrainian Student Society, Ukrainian Students Program, and the NGO Razom for this invitation and for hosting this meeting on this important issue. Today we were discussing also, you said how the humanitarian issues are on the media. We have the sad news this weekend of the 4 killings of the UNICEF staff members. I express EU condolences. We had the terrible tragedy in the Mediterranean that shocks us and that makes us think that it must not be repeated again. It is not only a humanitarian issue; it's much broader. Here in Udo, I see it. I will repeat myself in many of the issues that he has said, because we completely agree. It's not a humanitarian issue; it's much broader than this. But humanitarian solutions are part of the solution. That there is a necessary band-aid. I would like to talk before a little. I would like to make an introductory part on ECHO, the organization I work for, within the European Union, to then talk about our assessment of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, to follow with some of the challenges that we have identified in this situation. So let me first describe a little bit of what is the humanitarian structure of the European Union. The European Union and its 28 member states are the largest humanitarian donor in the world. It is a shared competence. It is member states and the European Union itself, meaning that we run it in parallel in a coordinated manner. One key issue here is that our humanitarian action is based on principles. We have an European consensus on humanitarian aid, and one of the key issues is that we abide by the 4 humanitarian principles: humanity, independence, neutrality, and impartiality. Our humanitarian assistance is based only on needs. The EU acts in many crises in the world. Ukraine, of course, Syria, South Sudan, and also is particularly adamant in raising awareness about some of crises considered forgotten. In this regard, the Central African Republic is a good example of how we have been working to raise awareness on this. Within the European Commission, the organization I work for is ECHO, the Department of Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection. We are a donor. We are an active policy maker. That's the reason why we have an office in New York to liaise with the United Nations, also in Geneva. And we have offices, global presence across 44 field offices across 39 countries. We have not only humanitarian assistance, but also civil protection. Civil protection consists of governmental aid delivered in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. I refer to this because in this case in Ukraine we have also activated this mechanism. This mechanism does not only coordinate the 28 member states civil protection structures, but also those of Iceland, Norway, and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia and Montenegro. Serbia is going to join us very soon. So after this advertising part, I would like to share with you our assessment of the Ukrainian situation. You know, the conflict started in April 2014, and despite the ceasefire agreed in Minsk on 12 February and enforced on 15 February, the situation is still bad. The fighting continues and the selling carry on. Over 1.2, as Ala said, over 1.2 million people are registered as internally displaced, and more than 800,000 people have fled eastern Ukraine to seek refuge. Out of 5.2 million people living in the conflict area, around 3 million are considered to be especially vulnerable. In addition to that, it's estimated that more than 6,000 people have already died because of the conflict. Despite the new IDP law that Udo referred, there are still many challenges ahead. Simplification of procedures for humanitarian assistance, tax exemption for humanitarian aid, still there and need to be addressed. Returnees, refugees, and internally displaced persons need shelter, food and sanitation items, as well as proper healthcare and psychosocial support, education, and protection. Another big concern is the medical supplies that are in scarcity in the area. Despite the ceasefire agreement, access to Donetsk and Luhansk remains a challenge. There is a new temporary order of movement of persons and vehicles that is hindering the humanitarian assistance of the regions. Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, we defend this everywhere. The government of Ukraine bears the primary responsibility. In addition to this, Ukraine is a middle-income country with a strong and active civil society that actually was the first responder. Host communities have been responding, local civil society organizations, the local Red Cross, and national NGOs. A number of strong private Ukrainian foundations are active and providing support. Management of internally displaced persons is led by the Minister of Social Policy, and the local authorities are also taking their role. In the areas reclaimed by the government over last summer, the Ukrainian authorities have begun to provide support to rehabilitate housing, restore gas and water supply and food supplies. Saying this, I will tell you a little bit of what is our EU response. Well, the European Union and its member states, as I said, their competence, have committed over 139.5 million euros since the beginning of the conflict in humanitarian assistance and early recovery aid. The member states have contributed with 91.7 million euros, and the European Commission with 47.85 million euros. Our aid addresses the basic needs of the population, the internally displaced refugees who have fled the conflict areas and the returnees. The EU ECHO, my organization, the Department for Humanitarian Assistance, alone has provided 26 million euros. It's been 10.8 last year, 2014, and 15 million euros committed for this year. They are aimed to fund emergency assistance and food, shelter, medicines, hygiene products, and half of this assistance will benefit the conflict, the non-government health areas. Our relief aid targets especially those who are most vulnerable, female-headed households, elderly children, and persons with disabilities. ECHO is present in the country, is present in Kiev February 2014, and it plays a role to coordinate other European donors and assistance. It also plays a role through the European Civil Protection Mechanism. Our priority areas are protection. Udo has referred to this very clearly. Support, registration, access to documentation, legal counseling, assistance to victims, mine action, and child protection. Health is a big issue here too. We are supporting the provision of primary health and secondary health care, rehabilitation, epidemiological surveillance, and also psychosocial interventions. Food assistance, livelihood, shelter, and non-food items here, working closely with UNHCR. Water, sanitation, and hygiene here with close collaboration with UNICEF. Coordination and capacity building. As Udo already referred, there is a huge challenge in generating capacity in the government of Ukraine in order to tackle with this huge crisis. The European Civil Protection Mechanism has acted in this crisis. The European Commission, in this case, co-finances the transportation and coordinates the delivery of the aid provided by member states. It's been in a joint humanitarian action. 3 EU charter cargo planes and several trucks carry some 85 tons of relief items in January 2015, coinciding with a visit of our commissioner, Christos Stylianides, who is coordinating the humanitarian response of the European Union. In addition to this, a civil protection team with experts from 7 EU member states has been deployed in March 2015 to support the Ukrainian government improving emergency risk management. The EU, besides the humanitarian assistance, is also working on the early recovery of those affected by the conflict. It has allocated 17 million euros from regional development funds and 4.5 million euros for community stabilization, facilitation of return and reconciliation, and support to the implementation of the internally displaced persons registration system. Also, there is assistance provided to refugees in Russia and Belarus through the National Red Cross. So this could be our assistance, but there are many challenges ahead. As I said, the situation continues to deteriorate. There is a ceasefire agreement, but still there are violations of this ceasefire. So it must be respected. In this regard, we support the monitoring mission of the OSCE, and we consider that the UN should play an important role monitoring the humanitarian assistance, informed by a reference group of humanitarian experts. The EU will stand ready to provide expertise to the government of Ukraine and also to this kind of missions. Also, it is fundamental that international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles are respected by all parties to the conflict. That is not still the case. Another challenge is for the Ukrainian government to be able to centralize its response in an adequate manner. In this regard, again, the expertise of the European Union is available to make it happen. And one of our main concerns is the legislative and regulatory framework. There have been advances. The IDP regulation in Ukraine has allowed to give a framework to the displaced persons, but still we have challenges in terms of funding of these measures, and also in terms of some still incoherence and some problems such as I mentioned, access to frontline that with this temporary order is being blocked to some humanitarian missions. Also, the obstacles such as customs, the tax for humanitarian relief items, all those should be evaluated in order to improve the donors, the action of the humanitarian partners. Access, as I said, is important, and it's still being very difficult in those who are in non-government control areas. We will advocate to ease this access and to allow the humanitarian actors to act more easily. It is good news in this regard that the UN has opened an office in Donetsk that probably would help to the whole humanitarian community to act better. There is concern about the cut-off distribution of social payments to the citizens registered in non-government health areas. This impact should be assessed in order to try to improve the situation of those who are affected. And finally, on our part, the humanitarian response plan of the UN is funded so far only 21%. So the international community must consider how to address this crisis. The EU and its member states will have to evaluate how to make it better in order to tackle with this huge crisis. In conclusion, I will repeat something that Udo has said. Humanitarian action is just a band-aid. It is not going to be the solution of this crisis. The solution will be through a political dialogue that would end in a lasting solution, but it's a necessary one, and the EU will stand ready to help. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Dragan Markovic from UNICEF will speak on the emergency situation on the ground.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you, Udo and Jesus, for very good remarks thus far. That actually makes my presentation a lot easier because you have covered quite a lot of ground, so I will not be giving you as many numbers as actually quite a few numbers have already been shared by my distinguished colleagues here at the panel. Then I will dwell on the authority that so kindly Udo had given me, as I indeed have been to Ukraine relatively recently. As Allah had introduced me, I work here in the headquarters in the Emergency Programs Office for UNICEF, and I'm the desk officer, as we call it, for different parts of the world, including Ukraine. So my role is essentially to try to augment and empower the voice of children of Ukraine and colleagues at UNICEF and other partners here at the headquarters level for the various advocacy activities that we do, interagency planning and coordination of the humanitarian assistance. Let me now take you to a journey which takes place in February, and I will take you to the place called Izum. Some of you may actually know it or have been there, but it is a small place, a typical place of the east of Ukraine, not more than a couple of tens of thousands of people living there. It's hour and a half roughly ride from Kharkiv. And when you get there, you actually see, and it was unfortunately a rather gray day, and it was snowing, and it was fairly cold. But you see a relatively usual place for that part of Ukraine. So people on with their usual business, ailing industry around, combination of vehicles, some of a newer date, quite a few of not so new date, here and there a cart. And then just off from the main road, we stopped in our vehicle in front of a house that is right next door to a small grocery shop. And we were met in a yard of a house, private house, by quite skinny but very dynamic and energetic young woman. And she rushed us into a basement, sort of a wine cellar, though that sounds quite romantic, but it's actually a basement of a private house. And there we entered into utterly different world. There was at one corner children who were drawing and playing with randomly collected toys that actually people of Izum have collected themselves. In the next room, there was, and the room was pretty much of the size like this one, but the ceiling was actually lower. You had piles of clothes that were, again, collected by the people of Izum. And in a very disciplined and sober way, I would say, women of different age, men of different age, while their children were drawing in the next door room, were going through those clothes and were actually picking up things that they would need or their dears would need, because women were collecting clothes also for men and women and children, as it appeared. And then right next door, there was a smaller room where counterparts, colleagues of the woman that met us, were helping people navigate through, I'm afraid, typical type of bureaucracy that it's unfortunately still in the DNA of many of the people there, but it at least worked fairly quickly, and people were receiving packages that have come from the various, this time international organizations, including from our colleagues from UNHCR, from our colleagues from United Nations Development Program. There was some of supplies that UNICEF was able to bring, a few other non-governmental organizations, including, for instance, the Danish Refugee Council, Save the Children, etc. And that was in February. And what I also have seen during the couple of hours that I've been there was a young man. I would not say that he was more than 24 or 5, who came with his children and who were ushered immediately to that small room where the drawing lessons were going on and some play. But he was very, very distressed. He was actually shaking and apparently could not control his emotions because he was actually describing through what he has just been and what is he enduring and passing. And the person that talked to him was a medical nurse who was, again, not more than 20-something years. And I later talked with her, and she has just finished her medical school, hardly had any experience, but bravely worked with that young man, and as she told me, many other, both young and middle-aged, and as Udo was also referring to elderly people who were passing through that basement. That kind of gives, as far as I could give it to you, a bit of a portrait of what's going on in the east of Ukraine. You have a remarkable, heroic, I would say, mobilization of local people. They were there to reach out to their brothers and sisters from the very onset. And as Jesus reminded us, although from New York Times, we know more of what was happening in January, February, situation is actually going on for quite some time. Second, you would not be able, even in Izum, which is, by the way, some perhaps not more than 60, 70 kilometers from what then was the front line, you would not really see, at least not right away, the conflict. However, the conflict is there, and it is inside the people. But it came to them, and it's still very much so, a shock. The people are still grappling to understand, to deal with it, and to eventually mobilize what they do have, their wish to actually regain peace, try to reach out to all those who are on the other side, with unfortunately many bridges being broken as we speak. Our colleagues from the combination of UN agencies and international NGOs, as Udo had said, recently visited Ukraine, went to Donetsk. That was just shortly after the Minsk agreement has been signed. When I was there just before the latest Minsk would be signed. So I was not able to go to Donetsk because the security situation was actually bad and we couldn't go. There were too many risks, which I utterly regret, but anyway. Our colleagues from the emergency programs of the UN agencies and the international NGOs went in and have actually seen what is the immediate aftermath of the conflict, which unfortunately kind of continues as a bit of a trickle. And one of the messages that they brought, which I saw as well, is that it is women and children who really bear the brunt of the crisis. It is them who have been both on the front line, staying, or in displacement to reach out for safety while their men were wherever they were. That situation, unfortunately, is not any more different now. And actually, these are the population, or these are the faces of up to 5 million people, as we have estimated, that are in need of humanitarian aid, of which 3.7 of very vulnerable. UNICEF estimates that within that number, there is 1.7 million children. Within the registered displaced population, the statistics, official statistics says, as Udo was referring, over 150,000 children, but we honestly believe that this number is actually very low. We believe that the number is higher. As Jesus and Udo were saying, our task is to help our government counterparts to actually improve the methodologies for registering every single person and taking the full account of who are they. And I'm sure that we will be able to find that there are actually more children. One of the issues that is of particular concern is that not only that they were bearing the brunt of the crisis, but they were children, victims of the crisis as well. They are amongst the killed, they are amongst the wounded, They are amongst who have also been killed by the unexploded mines, and there are who are at a biggest risk of all those, and those are many. In cooperation with our partners on the ground and with assistance also from our friends from ECHO, we are able to launch, just to give you an example, a program on mine risk education. Our data tells us that there is more than 33,000 unexploded ordnance that we know of. And there is unfortunately many, many more. And that is actually a risk that is every day, every hour. I just spoke with Kiev this morning, and they told me that bad weather that is now in Ukraine, like a lot of rain and snow, actually tends to move the land. So even if somebody knew where the mines were, now you may actually have them moving or sliding with the land and the mud. And that actually already high risk increases even more. My colleagues have discussed at quite a length on what are the global aspects of both the humanitarian crisis and the response. Let me not repeat way too much, but let me emphasize that, first of all, we are working together with the government of Ukraine, who, as Udo and Jesus rightly pointed, have the primary responsibility to protect people who need assistance. But there is recognition of Ukrainian government that they cannot do it all by themselves. And that, I think, is, no matter how hard it is, a positive development. In that sense, we have all communicated our readiness to assist, and we do have the framework which Udo had mentioned, the Humanitarian Response Plan, that has been actually launched jointly by the government, or together with the government. What is important also to realize is that we are all working together in partnership, and the Humanitarian Response Plan is a joint document. It's a chapeau under which the UN agencies, international non-governmental organizations, and myriad of partners from the local community, the civil society, join together to make an estimate of what are the prioritized needs. Let me spend another few minutes to inform you what the Children's Agency of the UN prioritizes. But please bear in mind that this is something that we prioritize hand in hand with our partners, and concretely with United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who are in Ukraine, as Udo had said, in charge of a sector of protection, which really means a lot of things. We are, together with them, we have established a subgroup on child protection. And then as of recently, there is actually even the subgroup that looks into the issue of mine risk awareness and education, because we all believe that it is part of the broader framework of protection. Before I give you some idea of what we are doing or what we are trying to do, and planning to do, better to say, let me also say that at least for United Nations Children's Fund, the legal framework for the population of our concern, which are basically children and their caregivers, Ukraine is a signatory of, and that's the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Now, truth is, before this conflict, we have worked within this framework to try to have the policy framework of Ukraine being more inclusive of principles underpinning the CRC. Unfortunately, we are now in the situation when the Convention of the Rights of the Child serves as the guidance for our own humanitarian action. This is something, as I did say before, is something that not many had expected only 2 years ago, but that's the reality. What are the main issues of concern to UNICEF? Many. There is actually a plethora of things where we are both engaging in terms of analyzing the situation, helping our government counterparts to deal with it, but then also engage ourselves. So protection, including aspects of the protection, psychosocial or psychological support. Unfortunately, the levels of psychological distress in Ukraine amongst many is very high, and it's increasing. We do have evidence that people exposed to the conflict are now confronted with the post-traumatic stress syndrome that is further compounded by the risks of violence at home, sexual and gender-based violence, or simply inadequacy of a parental role that caregivers or parents have with their children. But children themselves are traumatized too. We can see that already, unfortunately, through the drawings that they are producing. A lot of children who are no longer in their places of origin do struggle to reintegrate in the schools where they are going. Unfortunately, far too many schools have been destroyed, both in the non-government controlled areas and in the areas under control of government. At one point, in those conflict-affected areas, nearly half of children were out of school. And even now, those percentages being improved, quite a few of them have problem to integrate and are actually, as unfortunately we have seen in other contexts mentioned here, that integration is something that brings a lot of these post-conflict effects, such as traumatization, psychological difficulty to concentrate, to learn, to play. The second thing that we are having as our concern, and Jesus mentioned it, there's been quite a colossal damage to the services provision, basic services provision, water, sanitation, hygiene. Those systems of provision were broken. And so together with our government counterparts, other partners, we are forced to bring supply amidst all the problems illustrated so far, because we can't really effectively be there everywhere that it's needed, effectively have access as we are, as it was repeated here, impartial and neutral, etc. And water is water, it's not a political commodity, though it can become, unfortunately. But anyway, we have been, together with our partners, delivering water, trying to help communities to repair their infrastructure, try help the families to get the basic hygiene kits, and we are doing this as repeated distributions. We are reaching, at the moment, around 180,000 people. We are hoping to reach more. Primary healthcare is also one of the areas where UNICEF, together with our colleagues from World Health Organization, are looking at. What we are specifically focused on is maternal and child health care, and specifically immunization. Unfortunately, Ukraine does not have very remarkable records of immunization even beforehand. And the numbers of children that are immunized regularly has been amongst the lowest, I'm afraid, in Europe and in this part of the world. This is now further compounded by the crisis. We are concerned that actually many children do not have access to vaccination or are missing on their vaccination. And that is actually something that UNICEF has also put in its priority to help the government effectively procure the needed vaccines, and then UNICEF, wherever needed and possible, is bringing those vaccines to those medical institutions that need it. We are also concerned for the nutrition of young children. Luckily, we are not in the situations where there is a rampant malnutrition, such as is the situation in the countries elsewhere in the world, including Somalia, where unfortunately it happened what happened today. However, the conflict in Ukraine has broken the supply chains, has impoverished people, has emptied the stores in many places where I've been. And so mothers and fathers do not have necessarily all the things that they need for their young infants. So we keep promoting the breastfeeding as one of the best practices for the early infant feeding, but unfortunately, the stress caused by the conflict has increasing number of mothers who stop too early and then resort to complementary feeding. So this is actually something that we are also focusing ourselves on together, as I said, with our partners, etc. And finally, our concern is the process of education and learning. And in that sense, UNICEF, together with other partners, including Save the Children and our government counterparts, we are aiming to make sure that children restore their education, restore learning, have also some fun and play, as schools should have. And that's why we also link to training of the teachers, making sure that kids go back to school, that there is some supply for those who have lost many of their things and possessions, that there is also psychological assistance available in schools. As I did tell you, many children who are in displacement do have a problem to integrate into the new environment to which they have come not by their own choice. I will leave it here, and I'm happy to, as my colleagues as well, answer some of your questions. Thank you for your attention.
And so we'll open the floor to questions. Gentleman in the back.
Yes, to Mr. Markovic. Good evening.
Can you
I'm
please
working-
name yourself and
Yeah, my name is Rene Sosa, and I'm actually lecturing at the University of Lviv, Franco, which is the national university. And I've been traveling through Ukraine, and actually I have several projects that I've implemented that are actually being run through different NGOs. But my question is as follows. I'm working with officials in charge of orphanage in Lviv Oblast, and many of these orphanage and sanatoriums are at capacity. There are a large flux of civil orphans as parents can no longer care for the children. What resources are available to these orphanages and officials through UNICEF for the displaced children of Eastern Ukraine that burden these for expansion of services and resources? And what is the protocol for such requests?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for the important reminder.
I think we'll collect about 2-3 more
Oh,
questions
sorry.
and then we'll address them. Yep. Any other? Please, gentlemen.
I am Ismail Iskandarov and Umut Muzarif from Azerbaijan. We had one event in UN office and we got this discussion and think that it is important to must be here because Azerbaijan, as you mentioned, has long history with occupation and internally displaced people. My suggestion only here for students that organize this meeting, Ukrainian students, please mobilize yourself, help your country, and these gentlemen will help you in at the beginning. But then they will forget because Azerbaijan, as I said already, more than 20 years occupied country by our neighbor country. Of course, support by Russia, and same in Ukraine, as you see, and more than 650,000 IDPs now is living in different parts of Azerbaijan, and children already forget this process and this organization, and they forget this process, and only ourselves and our government has to solve this problem. Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, my question is, most of you were talking about, let's say, immediate needs, and I understand the humanitarian principles as well, but what especially your organizations are doing for, let's say, the long-term objective, or at least to find some more sustainable results in your actions? And do you actually cross-check with other UN agencies, or especially with donors operating in the region? And what you've learned, let's say, from the crisis in former Yugoslavia, and how those lessons learned would be implemented, let's say, in Ukraine?
Thank you. So we'll start, with these questions.
Thank you, Ala. So again, thank you for the question and thank you for the reminder. That's actually one important piece of work that UNICEF had dealt with even before. Our orientation towards the issue of children's institutions before the conflict has been to help the government of Ukraine reform its policy and eventually work towards eliminating the institutions in the sense that they exist or existed before, and rather introduce the policy framework and practice that would actually enable the children who are without the parental care to have mechanisms of integrating into family-like environment. Unfortunately, the conflict has stopped the reform process, or at least severely affected it. Some of those institutions, as the gentleman rightly have said, that were either inside the conflict zone or close to the conflict zone had to even evacuate children. Some of those children then have been transferred to other places. You would probably know more than me about the situation in Lviv, but I know also of Odessa and a few other places elsewhere. UNICEF has work or the protection of children in institution is actually something that is in the center of our humanitarian action as well, and our, as much as possible, continued development work. There are resources that are now channeled to ensure that there is adequate provision of supply to some of those institutions that have been affected by the conflict, or that there is training, supply. We are not really providing much because actually the whole idea is to have the government of Ukraine to take that responsibility. But we are there to monitor the situation so that in other institutions, children are not forgotten and bearing the brunt of the situation overall in the country. When it comes to monitoring of the situation, we are monitoring especially the possible situations that some children may unfortunately disappear in the process and then go to some families either in Ukraine or in elsewhere in unregulated manner, as that actually is also one of the aspects that comes into play as a risk in the situation. I hope I have asked or answered at least some of your questions.
Well, is there a vector to address the need of these resources, or to ask for resources directly to UNICEF, so that it is not going to be the highest level of government, but let's say government at the level of the oblast, that they would be in power to not only be able to create a matrix for what the needs may be, and also to be able to give you I guess a census of the number of children that actually are coming into their domain, so that you will be better informed, and also for them to ask directly for resources from you. Is there such a vector?
There is such vector. It's a child protection program of UNICEF within Kiev. And in that sense, we are having, through our partners as well, both at the oblast level and at the central government level, sufficient level of information of what's going on in many of those institutions, if not all of them. However, when it comes to their material status, the protection mechanisms, etc., our capacity will always be limited in the sense of covering all. But in terms of advocating, in terms of making investigation together with our government counterparts, that is definitely something that remains as our commitment. So in that sense, when it comes to UNICEF, we are the vector in that sense, but then we collaborate with the ministries that are in charge, as well as oblast authorities, etc. Prior to the conflict, we were involved in helping the government to actually reform the whole policy framework so that rather complicated, complex legislative and normative arrangements around the institutions are better streamlined, are clearer, and protection more effectively delivered. With the conflict, we now have a little bit of the double trouble, shall I say. One is care and protection for the kids in those institutions that were affected directly, and then maintaining some level of service in those where the situation, at least conflict-wise, was not so bad. Thank you.
Another question? Yeah, would you like to-
Perhaps to the third question, at least, I thank our friends from Azerbaijan for reminding us of something that is very much ingrained in our DNA. We know very well the number of displaced that are left in Azerbaijan from the conflict. Fortunately, the government in Azerbaijan has the means to tackle that and does not depend as heavily as others on international assistance. And so you are in a very fortunate position by comparison. But I thank you for reminding us of that protracted, one of the longest protracted displacement situations in Europe. But to the last question, I think this is what deserves an answer. I think, what lessons have we learned from the Balkans, and what can we do in the medium or longer term beyond the emergency patch-up? Palliative care, we sometimes feel, is all we do. And that's a very valid question. We have learned that it is, of course, much more difficult to provide assistance uniformly to people in non-camp settings. We really have to go back to the drawing board and see, how do we reach people? How do we maintain in touch with people? How do we make sure that we do not duplicate the assistance? And we have rolled out by now a robust registration system, to the extent, obviously, largely dependent also on access to the affected population, but a registration system that is based on smart cards. In other words, we go from the early registration into iris recognition with an ID card that ultimately is generated for the individuals, that not only gives the basic biodata that you would need of the individual and dependents in the family, but also particular vulnerabilities that we detect right from the word go. Sometimes it takes a second or even a third interview, especially when you go into some sensitive protection issues, including rape, which has taken place, obviously, on a significant scale in the situation as well. There are unspeakable horrors going on in the country, including disappearances of people, torture of people, and clearly there are quite a number of people who have a very valid refugee claim, and obviously to the extent that we need to facilitate to take those life stories, that has to be protected, for one, but for two, can also be amassed together in a robust rollout of such a registration system. But it also includes issues that relate to school-age children. And clearly, this is one of the lessons learned, at least personally for me, from the Western Balkans context. We always treated education as an afterthought. When the population concerned always put it immediately after security, sometimes even above food and daily necessities. The preoccupation with the future of the children deserved a much higher rating in terms of the priority that we would generally afford it than what I've seen in the Balkans. And that is, for me, a primary lesson. Something that I felt was very powerful from Dragan's first-hand description, which I hope you agree with, is what it actually means in a country or in a situation that is largely rural-based, where the home economy was still one foot in an industry, in a paid wage job, and the other foot was still on the land, in terms of people having access to fruit trees, potatoes that they plant, a home economy that is based on agricultural produce, that frankly was the lifesaver for a lot of that affected population. for many of the affected population. What you might not know is that the stress of war, for example, has very concrete effects on diabetes. I've seen many, many people in the Balkan context who were affected by the stress of war with diabetes to a point where they needed not just, a subcutaneous injection that you can administer yourself of insulin, but they needed intravenous insulin, which is very costly, very hard to come by, and impossible for the population in the non-government controlled areas. This is the real life situation that many people face. And you mentioned another keyword, Razom, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. This is not just some fancy, postmodern disease or fad that is only existing in the US and in advanced countries, but this is something that people deal with on a daily basis when they cannot sleep, when they cannot work, they cannot provide for their families, where mothers, out of the stress of war, stop producing sufficient milk to feed their kids, their newborns. I mean, these are not theoretical concepts. This is the real everyday, day-to-day life. And for me, the response was always one of local, non-governmental organizations that reach out and try to take care of that particular vulnerability. And they try out as the assistance regime fades out and as the CNN cameras move elsewhere and as the international donor community moves on when their assistance is most needed. So what we need to do is from the beginning to try and look into a system of sustaining those local non-governmental efforts as long as need be, not as a short-term response to the needs on the ground. I mentioned education. Clearly, what is required is the overall advancement of the legal concept, the legal context in the country, everything that I would put under the rule of law or what our protection response encapsulates, not a theoretical, legal, abstract, but protection in the sense of a humanitarian protection regime is very concrete, starting with registration, starting with making sure that those who have a claim to egregious crimes having been committed, to being registered, to being heard, and ultimately being, a part of a system where impunity has to end and has to come to an end. That has also been a lesson from the Balkans, very concrete lesson. Legal aid has produced wonders. Legal aid in the sense that we recruited in the height, or at the height of the displacement in the Western Balkans, a whole army of unemployed legal staff, lawyers, judges, prosecutors, and asked them to provide legal aid on a non-commercial basis to the clientele, which were basically the displaced, who wanted to know what do they need to do if they want to return to the country, if they are returned within the country, how can they ensure their property is protected, how can they claim their labor rights to the extent that they existed by regaining some of their former jobs or employment, and any other legal aspect under the sun that may have been on their mind for which they needed help. That was a cheap but an extremely efficient, I felt, response to the needs of the population. Lastly, Hillary Clinton was instrumental as the wife of the former president at the time to create what became the grande dame of all future women's initiatives in the Western Balkans. The Women's Initiative, frankly, for me, worked wonders. Women are not only bearing the brunt, as we heard again today from Razom, of the conflict, they are also the first who are willing to reconcile. Men are still, fighting each other, killing each other. Women already start talking to each other because it's their instinct. It's their contribution to society. It's their own natural response on how to, protect themselves, their families, and make sure that whatever is possible is undertaken. And therefore, I think the Women's Initiative for me has been one of the long-term memories that I retain from the Balkans that I would like to see repeated in all other countries.
Thank you, and also drop in the comment, right?
Yes, I did want to, if you would allow me, build a bit on answering to your question on lessons learned. I am from the West Balkans,
I worked there as well, so.
or from, though that term it's yeah,
EU jargon.
ex-Yugoslavia or Serbia. Udo will remember, beside the lawyers, there were also many psychologists who also were involved in the army of people who, and so this is how I got to be born into this world, 30 years now on here with UNICEF. But I started at the grassroots level. The lessons learned and on the long term, you know, your question is very logical, and the common sense would say, of course, we need to move away. And of course, we need to start thinking in the long term. One of the important experiences, and Udo had actually reflected on many, but is participation of people that are affected by the conflict in anything that is happening short term, mid term, and long term. And realization that what has happened, and it will not go away in any concept or paradigm of development. Development has to include the people who were affected. Their voices have to be heard. And they need to be not registered categories, but actually citizens who have the right to receive assistance, deal with the grievance, but also participate in what's going to be the path of the development. In Ukraine, the whole orientation of the nation, if you will, has been the genuine wish to push forward, to move away from the legacy of the past. Let's not go into that one because that's a subject of another discussion. But there were processes and commitments towards what you call development. It is important to preserve that path, and that's where our agencies, UNICEF sees itself having both humanitarian and development mandate. EU, other partners will continue supporting those processes. But we will be making a mistake, and that actually has been what pushed West Balkans or ex-Yugoslavia into protracted crises. People who were affected were, for a long, long period of time, excluded from the long term. There were some sort of a conveniently parked nuance or annoyance, sorry, that's what I mean. Making sure that we do empower women as indeed willing to reconcile, but also to speak what has happened to them. Making sure that education is finally understood in the humanitarian context, UNICEF argues for that, as a life-saving intervention, will help us eventually being smarter rather than convenient and complacent with what we mean by long term. We can't ignore what happened. So that would be my thinking on top of your question.
Thank you. We'll take a few more questions.
So building off of that though, relatively the international community, especially ECHO, has been pretty giving with humanitarian assistance. This is likely to dry up pretty soon, but a lot of the programs being developed, such as Save the Children, just got $3 million for schooling. What can be done to actually make these programs sustainable and empower the government or whoever, civil society in other sectors, so that that can be achieved based on your efforts?
Yeah.
I'm actually representing Razom NGO, and I'm one of the coordinators of Humanitarian Relief Drive. That's for refugees and Toy Drive. And I want to thank you for all you do. And I have a practical question. Going back to PTSD program, I just wanted to ask: is there a way for, as you had a chance to observe, there's a big volunteer movement against civilians, and I'm aware of a few initiatives that are starting for PTSD for both children refugees. And is there a way for them? But you have the whole experience, and you have experience seeing the same problems in different countries. But those people who started volunteers, not governmental volunteers, is there a way for them to get some sort of access to the resource or training or some sort of collaboration or a guide for them to to go on and do what you do on their small scale, on the small level, because it needs to be done. Is there any way to do that? And my second question, I'm going to be brief. So, how, as you probably faced many problems with the non-responsiveness from the current government, do you see any ways to overcome those? Maybe there's something that the Ukrainian society can do in order to to overcome those issues that I'm sure we both know what we're talking about, like government not always responsive. It's working on the way it used to work before the whole thing escalated. Like, I'm sure that's not as much feedback you're getting from current Ukrainian government as it's supposed to be. Am I clear? Was it a little bit confusing? What I'm saying, I understand, and I heard a lot of volunteers, because I'm very involved in I have a lot of contacts with Ukrainian volunteers, and what they say, that the government is not helping as much as they should and not responding as much as they could. And I'm just assuming that it's definitely different scale, not as a small scale that we rotated, but I'm sure there must be ways or advice for us to push certain buttons, if you can share that.
Great, I think we'll take one more question.
Yeah, I have a question from the internet. They're following live from the Google Plus community. They would like to know, since the Minsk II agreement, the situation for the refugees, is it getting better since the conflict has somehow subsided a little bit? Is there an improvement since the fighting is actually come to a hand thanks to the recent attempts to in Minsk, basically? That's one question. One question that I want to ask you. You pointed out correctly that this will be eventually a political solution to humanitarian. It will not solve the root cause that will keep staying there until it's solved. That's the reason why, for example, we as an NGO with UN accreditations in 2012, the year of the Nobel Prize to the European Union, started with this particular subject. I'm here with my colleague, which is basically humanitarian, non-political, as it's more easy to explain the suffering of human beings instead of the politics of interests, in which everybody can agree that causing pain and suffering, humanitarian suffering of fellow human beings, is something that has to cause some kind of reaction, no matter what side you are in. So regarding this, as international organizations, all of you, are you cooperating with all the regional powers, or do you have dividing lines? That's extremely important. At least on the humanitarian side, are you cooperating, for example, with Belarus, Russia, and other countries around which have so many immigrants and refugees there? Do you go beyond politics? Because if you can find at least common ground on the humanitarian side, which is not emotional in terms of political, then you can start building maybe on building aid and to who is suffering, rather than trying to look at interests which are politically based, which are hard to resolve. That's the questions.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, we'll ask for concise responses if possible.
Oh, yes. Especially that last question.
Yes, please.
We leave that to you.
We're in good
Well, just address shortly on the long-term solutions. I think that you hit one important point. The debate is now there. Now I came today from a World Humanitarian Summit discussion, and is there how to make this address the long term, how to make it compatible with the humanitarian. There is no magical solution. There is no golden bullet. In this case, in Ukraine, it's not my area of expertise, but we have an association agreement. There is a package of 11 billion euros to address the transition of the country. It doesn't answer your question. It's going way beyond that, but there is a collaboration there. On the humanitarian system, how to make it sustainable. I think that well, my colleagues might have better ideas on this. In the case of ECHO, we are working on reinforcing the capacity of the government in order to create safety nets, social safety nets, in order to cover the future needs of the people in a sustainable manner. But of course, it's a big job there. I will jump to the cooperation with Belarus and Russia. Here, one of the core ideas of ECHO is that we are in but out the political scene. So we keep contact with everybody, regardless of our political views in other concerns, because the core mission of ECHO is to address the needs wherever they are, and if it requires to discuss issues with whoever, that dialogue is never closed. Even if the political dialogue is closed, this will be open.
Would you like to
Yeah, just one comment on the capacities, on the building of capacities. Myself, I prepared several terms of reference for projects, including in Ukraine, and those were capacity building EU-funded projects. And very often they were bottom-up. The approach was bottom-up, so the information was coming from the Ukrainian government. The problem was that when we were developing the project and we started doing a background check in the situation, it turned out that there is a lot of funding in the capacities of Ukraine, including equipment. So I just don't understand, it's mentioned capacity, but actually the capacities have been funded heavily in the last, let's say, 10 years. And not only by the EU, but all the donors. And maybe there is also the need to strengthen this cooperation among donors, who funds what actually, because then it becomes a mess, especially for implementers, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
No, I understand that you cannot comment on this, but it's just.
If I may, just a couple of thoughts on the questions. I think on your question specifically, and what can be done to, if you like, capture the learning curve from other NGOs elsewhere. My organization at least does this as a matter of routine now, that we take governments and NGOs likewise for training and exposure visits to other parts of the world where that learning curve has been had, in order to short circuit and hopefully avoid that the same mistakes are made again. We've done that in the Bosnian context with many organizations. I remember very early on we brought representatives of the so-called breakaway regions from Georgia to Bosnia and exposed them to the discussions that we have there, so that they could make a judgment themselves as to what they saw and what they found in the Republic of Srpska or elsewhere. It's not as if there is only one road that leads to Rome, as one says, but there might be other alternatives as well. So I would explore that. There is a specific organization also in the European context called ECRE, E-C-R-E, that provides specific training events, over several days or even a week, to bring particular NGO staff together from the various disciplines. You referred to the obstacles that some of your local counterparts referred to. I mean, you can imagine in a situation that is in active conflict, where despite the fact that you would think anyone who has earned their right to have a pension through their lifelong work shouldn't be affected by a conflict, whatever the configuration of that conflict. You should be able to draw on your life's savings wherever you are, regardless of what your political or otherwise leanings might be. That shouldn't be a factor affecting whether you draw your pension or not. Unfortunately, that's not what the situation is like. And there is a question to answer, I think. There's a question to answer from the government, clearly. And I would think if anyone is seriously interested, if a government is seriously interested in capturing the hearts and minds of its population, I would think twice before I would put in regulations that basically prevent you from drawing on your pension because you need it. It's the most vulnerable of that population that you hit the hardest by preventing them from drawing their pension. The other, I hope that the humanitarian assistance from ECHO, among others, is not drying up, as was suggested, even though I know it is a lot to ask for these days. If you compare what my agency alone, 3 years ago, had a budget of around about $1.7 billion globally per annum. That's about the amount we spent this past year on Syria alone. I mean, that should make everybody think twice of what is going on at the moment. But at the moment, at least I feel that the situation in the Ukraine, as bad as it may be, but you now have a different benchmark to compare crises with, which of course is dwarfing everything else around the globe. And this is part of our problem. 9 out of 10 stories these days focus on Syria. Sometimes with a short side focus on the Mediterranean saga, where every day by now you see another boat capsizing, another unspeakable amount of people that drown or are suspected of drowning. But it's a short-term attention span, and it's a repetition that has a numbing effect, unfortunately. But for many of the world's crises, we don't see any frontline news. We don't see front-page news in the New York Times. We don't see reports on CNN or the BBC. That's the quiet crises that schlep on from year to year to year, which has led to the new phenomenon of the average time in displacement being 17 years plus. This is no longer a temporary refugee or internal displacement situation. In some places, like in Dadaab in Kenya, we have the 3rd generation of refugees growing up in a camp now. This is their life, this is their home, this is the only thing they've ever seen. Right? So we have to think beyond the short-term band-aid that we are providing, because it is a different cup of tea nowadays. I think I'll leave it there.
If you allow me a couple of points. First of all, thank you for the question on the sustainability. From my visit in Ukraine, but this is actually something that we are all working towards. These are not the projects of, or should not be the projects of Save the Children or UNICEF, or in that sense UNHCR, but programs for people in the process of education, and then building basically their raison d'etre and the way how they function by basically involving the teachers and the school environments, etc. And then that in itself, has some chances to become sustainable rather than it is a Save the Children or UNICEF project per se. Second point, important aspect of these programs for them to be sustainable, if it indeed is always having a capacity development component to it, so that people actually are indeed capacitated to do something more or better, or as Udo has referring beforehand, learn while intervening. And that knowledge and knowledge generation is actually the element of sustainability. And then finally, making sure that education type of projects indeed take place in schools or similar environments rather than in artificial environments would actually help that those gains remain in the environment where education will very likely continue. rather than if it's a case of an artificial environment where it's not very likely to continue. That brings me to the point on the PTSD, but you actually did mention also the volunteers and their learning. So Udo has pointed on some very important and valuable mechanisms for them to learn. UNICEF, just as well as UNHCR, is openly and proudly talking about the partnership with the government and non-governmental organizations. And whenever there is a legal entity that comes out of the volunteers group, we are proudly signing the legitimate contract to support their work. So in that sense, the training is also an important component. So on PTSD, UNICEF, but not only UNICEF, few others that I know of are actually investing a lot in drawing on the local capacity to extend training to many of the volunteers who have joined the work. And I would only expect that that trend will continue and that many of the Ukrainian volunteers and NGOs have the opportunity to also interact with other experiences and draw from lessons in some other parts of the world. One thing that I would, however, want to give as a message to you and your colleagues, but take care of yourself too, because PTSD is actually affecting those who help as well. And I remember that in my days in Serbia, you tend to run a lot, not seeing the situation. There is an adrenaline that kind of drives you, but in order to be able to effectively help, you have to take care of yourselves and, you know, try to measure the bites you want to make. But definitely, UNICEF's orientation is to have the training. And then, last point, you did mention the government and your evaluation of the levels of their service, etc. The role of organizations sitting here is not necessarily to address the issues that are at the political front, though we are part of the political environment. The only thing that I can say is that the principle that guides our work, and that's basically to work in partnership, to promote the participation of people affected, people who are there with a genuine orientation to also assist, is something that can actually create that capacity that I would want to believe no political establishment can ignore. And that's the best, I think, I can give as an answer, or at least recollect from my own experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Before closing the event, I'd like to give the floor to Catherine Herrera from SIPA Human Rights Group to announce and highlight the charity drive happening in Colombia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists. My name is Catherine Herrera. I'm from the Human Rights Graduate Group, and I served for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in Eastern Ukraine, in Dnipropetrovsk. When I was there, one of the things that I was struck by was the incredible generosity of Ukrainians. I had on multiple occasions babushkas who had virtually nothing give me dill and potatoes and fruit from their garden, and this was very. So in the spirit of that, I want to bring that to Colombia and have this charity drive. So what we've done is we partnered with Ukraine, with Oksana, and many of you here are from Razom. Within 6 dorms in Colombia, we have drop boxes. So you can bring things like toys, clothes, shoes, school supplies, hygiene items, and we'll be collecting those and shipping them to Ukraine. I think we have about 20 tons that we can bring, so space is no limit. Please bring as much as you have. For your convenience, I will be at SIPA tomorrow on the 4th floor. I'll be in front of a giant sign that's blue and yellow, like the flag, I will be collecting items there from 12 to 2 p.m. So if you have any questions, you can contact me. My email's right here, KAH2213@Columbia.edu. And we also have a Facebook page with all the information with the flyers and the map. So please donate.
I'd like to thank on behalf of all organizers and those are Columbia Human Rights Graduate Group, SIPA Human Rights Working Group, Ukrainian Student Society of Columbia, Ukrainian Studies Program of Columbia, NGO Razom, and NGO EU Association to thank our distinguished speakers for your wonderful and insightful comments and discussion and presentation on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, although it's not a happy topic, but it's incredibly important to raise awareness about it and take this discussion further. Thank you so much. And we have refreshments right behind the group, but we'll bring them in right now. So do stick around and mingle and talk to them. Thank you so
Okay, got you. Come on, Shane. You are.
I'll be back.
All of my groups are. Yeah, like this one's like How would you know how long you're okay, so the problem with that is that they and members of the Ukrainian Student Society yesterday were, with one guy, and the bus stop. Yeah, because they didn't we weren't organized.
literally like 2% like you're gonna go on and at the same time, the guy, the security guard, and I don't know if he's supposed to coordinate it. The point being, Margarita said this happened every year.
So you have
Yeah.
I would say there is a direct link between each other than temporary system.
They are, but in the long run, it's not complementary because they could for them as an option.
She has the flyer, she has the color flyer, she has the team, she has the
But obviously, you can't have integration by closing the windows. So, where they are now, they are
yeah, that's the one.
I'll take that. Here.
I can help you guys with
now that's another question.
So probably what is our social
So are you here now?
Hello. Hey Steve, how are you? Thank you. Folder. Yes, I was going to say that. Thank you.
But anyway,
Okay, thanks so much. I'm actually in the Columbia University. Thank you. Bye.
There's also the Red Cross
okay.
Giuseppe, scusa, fermo qua.
It does, of course.